So before we start, what may be useful is to ask the people in the audience, do they actually measure the CVP? And please be honest, it's like alcoholics, they never admit it. So please raise your arm if you actually measure the CVP. Yeah, so quite a bit. And the next question is, do you actually use the CVP to direct fluid therapy? Yeah. Okay. So hopefully after my talk, except for Selwyn, you're going to change. So I really don't have any disclosures of note, except don't believe a word I say. So as I'm going to show you, the use of the CVP leads to this condition of iatrogenic saltwater drowning, which is a potentially fatal disease. And indeed, the use of the CVP breaks the basic tenets of medical ethics, which is first the duty to promote good, and the second is the duty to do no harm. And I will submit that this use of the CVP breaks those basic ethical tenets. But I must start with the quote from the king of hemodynamics, Dr. Pinsky. So this is a useful starting point. Tachycardia is never a good thing. Hypotension is always bad. There's no such thing as a normal cardiac output. Central venous pressure is only elevated in disease, as we heard, and edema is of cosmetic concern. So I think those are really good starting points. But we'll move from those monitoring truths to the dwarf of hemodynamics. These are my guiding principles, which I think are really important. And the first is the only reason to give a fluid challenge is to increase stroke volume, fluid responsiveness. There's this idea of filling up the tank. I look around, nobody here has a tank with a little gauge that you fill up. Patients do not have gas tanks, so this idea of filling up the tank is ridiculous. The most important, and this is really the most important point, is that in patients who hypotension or oliguric, only 50% will respond to fluid. That is such a vital concept. So that means 50% are not going to respond and are going to be harmed. And the sicker the patient, the less likely they are going to respond to fluid. In the FACT trial, septic patients who are hypotensive, 23% of patients responded to fluid. 23. Therefore, fluid loading cannot be considered the cornerstone of resuscitation, and if you are septic, this is a dangerous path that you're going down. The second or third, physical examination, ultrasonography to a large degree, and the CVP cannot predict fluid responsiveness. As we heard yesterday, the hemodynamic response to a fluid challenge is very short-lived. Most studies, less than an hour. In a study we heard yesterday, 10 minutes. You're giving fluid, which goes from the bag into the tissues, bypassing the intravascular compartment. How does that help your patient? And what will be surprising to some people, a high CVP is a major factor compromising organ perfusion. Pushing the CVP above 8 is a major factor compromising organ perfusion. And I think these are very important principles to keep in context when you are resuscitating a patient with fluid. So, what is the central venous pressure? And when I don't know what to do, I go to the basic source of all medical information, Wikipedia. I think where Dr. Magda got most of his information. Anyway, Wikipedia tells us the central venous pressure describes the pressure of blood in the thoracic vena cava near the right atrium. And we see here how to measure the CVP. So the interesting question is, where did this concept come from? Where did it come from? This is the defining study, It's actually from Pittsburgh, so Dr. Pinsky should be quite proud. This was the very first study and the scientific underpinning on which the CVP is based. So these thoracic surgeons, they took 25 post-operative patients, they put in a peripheral line and measured the CVP. And you can see here is their blood pressure and heart rate, which is completely stable. This is their CVP swinging wildly for no apparent reason. And then without any summary statistics or inferential statistics, they just observed what they saw. They made this outrageous statement, an attempt to correlate known methods of evaluating blood volume with right atrial pressure has been effected in 25 post-operative patients. It has been determined that right atrial pressure is an accurate and sensitive recording of the effective circulating blood volume. That is the study. So if all of you who use the CVP, this is the scientific study on which it is based. So then we need to go on to this fairy tale. So this fairy tale, which many people like to believe in fairy tales, in tooth fairies, Santa Claus, and this is another bogus story that they believe in. And if we know, the CVP was central to both arms, both the treatment arm as well as the control arm used the CVP, and we told the CVP has to be 8 to 12. And then this was a letter I published afterwards because I knew it was bogus. And I said, basically, this makes no sense, the CVP, the mixed venous. So I knew then, when it was published, it lacked scientific rigor. But then we know there was something called the Surviving Sepsis campaign, which came out in 2004 and dictated how patients are resuscitated throughout the entire world, and I think even in other solar systems. And they tell us, this is what you do. So this is not what Dr. Magda does. This is, you give fluid, and you continue to give fluid, and you continue to give fluid until the CVP is above 8. And should you be on a mechanical ventilator, you've got to push it to above 12. So much like Rocky, which was a bad story, we have now Rocky 2, Rocky 3, Rocky 4. We have the same plot with the same bad actors with the same story. So, how many people actually use the CVP? So it's like using smoking or drugs. People won't admit it in public, but you know what? They do it. Maurizio does it. So this is a study by Maxine Cannison who asked the question, what tools do anesthesiologists in the US and Europe use in high-risk surgical patients? High-risk surgical patients. So most of them measured the blood pressure, but the most common monitoring technique was the CVP, way above any other disease. A method, you can see cardiac output monitoring was right at the bottom in high-risk surgical patients. They used the CVP to guide hemodynamic management. So unfortunately, people have forgotten about critical thinking. Humans are like lemmings. They just follow because we're told to do it. Our school teacher tells us what to do. We follow without any critical thinking. This is a flow sheet from China. You can see they measure the CVP. It doesn't matter where you go in the world, they measure the CVP. Even the psychiatrists measure the CVP. So this is a remarkable study. This is the ARISE study, where they randomized patients to early goal-directed therapy or standard of care. But you can see they actually randomized them to the same therapy because the CVP was exactly the same, 12, in both groups. So if you put in a CVP, doctors will push it to 12. It doesn't matter what you tell them. So this was a non-study because both groups of patients were treated exactly the same. They received fluids until they reached a CVP of 12. That was the ARISE study. So you can see how this CVP issue has basically changed the standard of care. And then what makes it even worse is the US is effective October 2015, the federal government in the United States has forced us to follow these guidelines. This is now a federal mandate that these was what you have to do. And part of this ridiculousness is you give them 30 mils per kilo, so you flood them with fluid, and even if you have acute lung injury or you have pulmonary edema, you intubate them. Yes, you intubate them so you can give them fluid. And then once you've actually done such a ridiculous thing, you then measure the CVP. That is the Surviving Sepsis campaign and the SEP guidelines, which I am forced to follow. It is insane. So, what is the evidence? So you have to think critically and demand evidence. You have to demand it. It's not optional. So this is one of the first studies that measured blood volume and central venous pressure. I'm sure all the statisticians in the room can see this very tight correlation between the two. This is even more impressive. I mean, you can see exactly how the CVP reflects volume. And really what's important to emphasize is that you can have a CVP which is 0, and you can be volume overloaded, you can see over here, or you can have a CVP of 25 and be volume depleted. So no matter what CVP you choose, you can be whatever you want to be. So this is another Dr. Sheldon said, going back to 83, CVP has shown to have a poor correlation with effective circulating volume in both absolute value and trends. It's either insensitive or misleading. And then we have the study, and there are hundreds of studies by Dr. Tabor, looked at volume responsiveness and found that the CVP was exactly the same whether you were a fluid responder or a non-responder. So clearly, it's really helpful in deciding whether to give fluid. So, in fact, I think the recent hemodynamic guideline put out by the Europeans said, well, you know what, it's the change in CVP. So do something, look at the change in CVP, and that tells you about change in stroke volume. And again, we can see it's a complete scatter plot. So the CVP or change in CVP is particularly useless. So we were arguing one day on rounds about the CVP, and when we decided, you know what, let's just do this meta-analysis. So basically, we concluded this systematic review demonstrated a poor relationship between the CVP and blood volume, as well as the inability of the CVP or change in CVP to predict the hemodynamic response fluid challenge. The CVP should not be made to use clinical decisions regarding fluid management. We called it a systematic review of the literature and the tale of 7 mares. So where do the mares come in? So this study stands alone. This study stands alone in the entire universe, which shows some relationship between blood volume and CVP. This was in 7 standing awake mares. So unless you have a mare in your ICU, you have no business measuring the CVP. So we then did an updated meta-analysis, and the editor said, well, what the hell are you doing this for? You've already made your point. Well, we said, yeah, we made the point, but no one believes us. And so repetition is important. You have to do it over and over and over and over again. And maybe someone will get the point. So we did more studies. And again, the AUC was 0.56, which is useless. You might as well flip a coin or measure toe length or the color of the hair. It's completely useless. And we said there's no data in any group of patients to support using the CVP to guide fluid therapy. This approach is potentially dangerous and must be abandoned. And this was the editorial by Dr. Kumar. Marik and Cavalesi have shown that we should not be utilizing the CVP to predict fluid responsiveness or volume status. And they obviously introduced this concept of venous return, which we heard yesterday, that venous return equals your mean circulating pressure minus the CVP. So paradoxically, if you give fluid and your CVP goes up more than your, as Maurizio demonstrated, your mean circulating filling pressure, you actually decrease venous return. So people said, well, you know what, he's talking BS. You know what, if the CVP is low or the CVP is high, it really gives me a lot of useful information. So Dr. Perner took 1,100 and so individual data sets and said, okay, I'm going to look, CVP is less than 8, 8 to 12, above 12, to see if it's of any diagnostic value. And you can see that didn't matter what you chose, it was a useless test, completely useless. This is from Kaplan's Cardiac Anesthesia, the 7 flawed assumptions assuming that the CVP predicts fluid responsiveness. So, and people will recognize, well, you know what, yeah, there's no scientific data to support it, but you know what, I believe in the CVP. It's my religious belief. I believe in the tooth fairy, I believe in Santa Claus, I believe in Mickey Mouse, and it's my constitutional right to use the CVP. So it's based on religion and religious feelings. I feel for it, rather than on science. So, but it goes further, because there are dangers associated with using the CVP. So as we know, as we've heard multiple times, blood flows from the left to the right. That's the way it works. So if your right atrial pressure is increased, the pressure must be transmitted backwards. It must be transmitted backwards. And there happen to be some important organs. This is the liver, which is connected to the splanchnic bed. There's another organ here called the kidney. And what happens when your right atrial pressure increases, the pressure in these organs goes up, particularly your encapsulated organs, the liver and kidney. The pressure is transmitted backwards. So this is a seminal study, I think this guy was in Dr. Magda's class. He's a physiologist, 1931. So what he did is he took a heart-lung preparation and he independently was able to alter venous and arterial pressure into the kidney. So what he found is that as he increased venous pressure, arterial pressure staying the same, there was a marked decrease in renal blood flow to the point it stopped, and urine output fell. And he found, that increasing venous pressure had a much greater effect on causing renal dysfunction and decreasing urine output than lowering your mean arterial pressure. So venous pressure is transmitted backwards. It's particularly bad in the kidney, which is an encapsulated organ. So the pressure increases significantly, increasing renal blood flow and infecting glomerular filtration. So is there any clinical data to support this? This was a study in patients with sepsis looking at acute kidney injury. The only factor predictive of acute kidney injury was a high CVP, not cardiac output, not any other factor, not blood flow. A high CVP was the only factor predictive of acute kidney injury, and you can see the starting point is about 8. And we know that surviving sepsis and the SEP1 guideline tell us we have to push the CVP above 8. Okay, and you can see as you push it above 8, your risk of renal failure goes up exponentially. This was a study we saw yesterday looking at microcirculatory flow. The CVP was the only factor predictive of impaired microcirculatory flow, which again makes sense because you have high backward pressure. This was a study looking at factors predictive of progressive acute kidney injury. The 3 factors, the most important was a low MAP and a high CVP, which in fact is your organ perfusion pressure. So a high CVP minus the MAP was the most important factor predicting progressive kidney injury. Then again, we have this slide, which is a phenomenal slide. This was from the VAST trial by Jim Russell, and they looked at CVP and survival, and you can see that patients with the lowest CVP had the best survival, and those patients who met the Surviving Sepsis Campaign guidelines, pushing the CVP above 12, had the lowest survival. Pushing your CVP above 12 kills your patients. Well, then let's look at the FACT trial. So as you know, in the FACT trial, they randomized patients to a fluid conservative or a liberal strategy. If you look at the arm that they used the CVP as a monitoring tool, so you can see this is the CVP. In the conservative group, the CVP stays below 8. In the liberal group, the CVP goes above 8. What did they show? In the conservative group, the mortality was 17% versus 36% in the group of patients who they pushed the CVP above 8. So we have another study demonstrating that pushing the CVP above 8 increases the risk of death. So as we said, pushing the CVP above 8 with fluids increases the risk of organ failure and death. Again, our king of hemodynamics, Dr. Pinsky. Central venous pressure is a stopping rule, not a target. So if you are going to do something as ridiculous as measuring the CVP, the only reason to use it is when to stop. When to stop. So if your CVP goes above 8, you stop. You do not follow Surviving Sepsis Campaign because that increases your risk of organ failure and death. You stop. So, as we heard before, a normal CVP is 0 to 4, probably 0. People have this ridiculous notion that a normal CVP is 8 to 12. That is simply not true. It's not true. And this is necessary to ensure venous return. So, clinicians compelled, if you put in a CVP and the CVP is less than 8, it is remarkable. There is this monosynaptic spinal reflex. It doesn't even go to the cortex. The doctor says, give fluid. CVP 6, give fluid. It is a monosynaptic reflex that has developed because of all the shenanigans that we've been through. So the only way to stop this is just stop measuring the CVP. Just stop. Don't measure it. There are more important things to measure. Your bank balance, the economy, the blood pressure, the cardiac output. The CVP is a waste of time. Thank you for your attention.